One of the big issues Christian apologists have always had problems with relates to the frequent and loud claims in the Gospels that, quote, multitudes of people, unquote, had begun following Jesus during his lifetime. The Bible tells us these people came from as far as Tyre and Sidon and Syria in the north and east, through Galilee to Judea and Idumea in the south, and that when he entered Jerusalem, huge numbers welcomed him into Jerusalem as well. And his following, we are told in Acts of the Apostles, continued to grow rapidly as Peter and Paul and the other disciples began successfully preaching far and wide after his death. But when we go through the accounts and records of historians and philosophers of the early first century, like Flavius Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, who also lived in the early first century and at the same period as Jesus and his apostles, these, quote, multitudes, unquote, are not mentioned at all, and Jesus as a Messiah figure and the Christian community in general are barely, if at all, mentioned by them. So, who is giving us the right picture? The independent writers of the time or the unknown authors of the Gospels who wrote their works a few decades later? Secondly, if we accept the Gospels' claim that Jesus had built up a considerable following, this raises an even bigger problem, and that is the problem of where these substantial numbers of Christians disappeared to during the momentous events of the First Jewish War, which broke out in 66 CE. In the war, the Roman army under Vespasian advanced through Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, making slaves of the population and razing towns and cities. But we have no records of Christians helping the Jews to prevent the country from returning to Roman control. And in particular, there is no evidence that they helped defend Jerusalem during the Roman siege of the city, which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and the razing of the temple. And that is very curious, as Jerusalem is holy for Christians as well. The war against the Romans lasted a lengthy 8 years, from 66 CE to 74 CE, and at no point in the records and histories that we have do we hear of Christians joining the Jewish side or even the Roman side, or simply staying neutral in a war that obviously affected them as well. And this goes not just for the Christian population of Jerusalem, but for the Galilee area as well, which was the stomping ground for Jesus and Judea in general. Our sources do not mention the Christian community at all during the conflict. The absence of the Christians during the war with the Romans isn't the only issue that arises. The other glaring problem is the complete lack of references to Jesus' alleged miracles and exorcisms in contemporary records. In the Gospels, there are frequent mentions of all sorts of demons and, quote, unclean spirits, unquote, possessing people at the time, and that needed to be ejected by Jesus. In addition, almost every page in the Gospels is littered with some sort of miraculous or paranormal activity. Even Satan makes an appearance, casually sitting on top of the temple with Jesus. Earthquakes and darkness in the sky are claimed to have happened during the crucifixion, along with zombies or dead saints walking in the streets of Jerusalem and being witnessed by many. So you could be forgiven for thinking that Jesus and his alleged miracles would figure large in the works of that period. But there is not a single independent witness from Jesus' time leaving a record of seeing him perform a miracle, whether he be Jew, pagan, Greek or Roman, or even a Christian of Jesus' time. These miracles are only mentioned in the Gospels written by his followers well after his death during the late 1st century. A third interesting problem is the prophecy of the destruction of the temple by Jesus as told in the Gospels, which is frequently touted as proof of Jesus' divinity by many Christian apologists right up to the present time. But there is no independent account of any Christian preachers taking advantage of the razing of the temple by the Romans and loudly and widely publicizing this prophecy to make easy converts in Jerusalem and the country in general immediately after the war. Surely that would have been the time for the Christians to really get the ear and attention of the public. But from the histories we have, we see there is complete radio silence from the Christian community, and this would suggest the prophecy was manufactured after the fall of Jerusalem and inserted into the Gospels when they were written near the end of the 1st century. Certainly it was only in the 2nd century and after the Gospels appeared that the Christians began making capital of Jesus' prophecy coming true. So, to keep the video of reasonable length, I won't be discussing all these issues today. Instead, I'd like to focus on the problem of the size of the Christian population, up to and including the Jewish war claimed by the Gospels, and how suspect these numbers really are. By the way, the video is split into chapters, and you can skip to any part of the video by clicking on the links in the description below. So let's look at the claim that the Gospel writers make that, quote, multitudes of people, unquote, followed Jesus as he travelled around. And this claim is repeated in numerous places in the Gospels. And this phenomenon of mass conversion and belief in this new Messiah happened not just in Galilee, we are told, but in all the towns and villages he passed through. And of course, this included Jerusalem as well. So let's go through the Bible verses and just run through a few of these examples. The earliest written gospel is by consensus believed to be that of Mark. And in Mark chapter 3, Jesus is said to have accumulated masses of followers, not just in Galilee, but from all over Judea, Idumea, east of Judea from Jordan, and even the areas of Tyre and Sidon, which were well away from the Jewish heartland. And he also mentions many followers from Jerusalem as well. At the Sea of Galilee, for instance, so many people wanted to listen to him that he was forced to speak from a ship on the lake to give himself some space. Matthew also goes out of his way to mention great assemblies crowding around Jesus wherever he goes. In Matthew chapter 4, in what appears to be a considerable amount of hyperbole, he claims Jesus was famous all across the province of Syria, a considerable patch of territory to the east of Galilee. And in Matthew 12, he also claims the Pharisees were so anxious about his increasing popularity that their leaders were holding councils in an attempt to bring him down. And Luke also uses similar language as Matthew to show immense crowds assembling to see and hear Jesus both from the Jewish heartland and outside neighbouring areas. He also mentions Tyre and Sidon to the north and Judea to the south. And John continues the theme, mentioning every one of this huge assembly being healed of any disease they might have had, an event that you'd think would make front-page news all around the Roman Empire. So, by the close of Jesus' ministry and on his entry into Jerusalem, the Gospels again stress that he was welcomed into the city by a huge host of people. The Gospel of John is the non-synoptic Gospel, meaning there's little common ground between it and the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And it is the gospel given to the most hyperbole, with John claiming the Pharisees were afraid that, quote, the whole world is gone after him, unquote, and were becoming believers of Jesus, and for that reason they'd begun plotting against him. And this theme is continued in the Acts of the Apostles. That the religion continued growing in leaps and bounds after Jesus' death is strenuously alluded to, with the apostles and other Christian preachers chalking up huge success. In Acts chapter 2, for instance, we find it written that the religion was spreading rapidly in Jerusalem itself, with thousands converting at meetings. And it even alleges that many of the Jewish priests were converting en masse to the new sect as well, which surely would have signalled alarm bells in the Jewish establishment. So, as you can see from the map, even though Jesus was largely just preaching in the Sea of Galilee area, and only for around 3 years at the most, the Gospels suggest pretty much the whole of Judea, Samaria, Idumea, Phoenicia, and the Roman province of Syria was turning to the new faith. And even allowing for considerable exaggeration, the numerous allusions to massive crowds following and meeting Jesus wherever he went would suggest a sizable section of Jews had been enthusiastically converted to Christianity by Jesus on his own, never mind the 30 years of intense evangelization by his disciples and apostles that followed after his death. Now, if we are to believe in this phenomenal growth, then it follows that the Christian community would have had a sizable say in everyday life and would have been mentioned by contemporary writers of the time. And they would certainly have had a large influence on matters and a considerable say during the Jewish war with the Romans through sheer numbers, whether they supported the Jews in fighting against the Romans, or whether they even allied with the Romans against the Jews, or whether they simply stayed neutral. These large numbers, whichever way you look at it, would have had an effect in one way or another. However, non-Christian accounts paint a very different picture. So let's go through some of the earliest works we have from the time of Jesus, and shortly after from people who either lived in Judea or Jerusalem or close by, and who wrote their works earlier or at the same time as the Gospel writers. And two of the most well-known are the famous Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria and the historian Flavius Josephus. Both Philo and Josephus were deeply involved in Jewish affairs and were well-educated, well-read, and well-informed as to events in Judea and Jerusalem and the wider world. Both had travelled to Rome and knew Greco-Roman culture as well as their own Judaic milieu. Philo was a direct contemporary of Jesus and his apostles and lived in nearby Egypt. He wrote extensively on philosophy, theology, and the politics of the time, and many of his works still survive. He was well known in Jewish circles and is arguably the most well-known Jewish thinker and writer of his time, and his works are some of the most important records we have of Jewish thought of that period. We know Philo visited Jerusalem and Judea at least once in his lifetime, and this may well have been during Jesus' time since they lived in the same decades. His background was very much upper class, coming as he did from a wealthy and powerful family which had connections with the priesthood in Jerusalem as well as connections to the Jewish royal families. Philo was one of those chosen to lead a delegation to meet Emperor Caligula on matters regarding the anti-Jewish riots in Alexandria in 38 CE. Josephus, our second source, was born slightly later than Philo and only 4 years after Jesus' death. He lived in Jerusalem and therefore may well have also met Jesus if not for his untimely death. But he was a contemporary of Peter and Paul and the other apostles, and as you can see, he wrote his works around the same time as the gospel writers were writing their accounts. Josephus is arguably more important than Philo for several reasons. Firstly, he wrote a very comprehensive history of the war with the Romans in his superb work Bellum Judaicum, or the Jewish War. And this was written around 75 CE, and he records the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in stunning detail. In this work, he also famously narrates the last stand of the Jews at Masada from 72 to 73 CE. Josephus is the only comprehensive account we have of these two famous sieges, and he was heavily involved in the war himself and would travel extensively in the Sea of Galilee area as the commander of Jewish forces in this area and was responsible for the defences of these towns. He would put up a stiff resistance himself at the town of Jotapata before eventually surrendering to superior Roman forces after the fall of the town. And as anyone who has read the New Testament will know, this was the same area where Jesus travelled and did most of his preaching and miracles. Josephus was also a native and resident of Jerusalem, the place where Jesus visited and where he was crucified. Despite being a practicing Jew, his work is factual, and Josephus presents a plain, unvarnished and factual account of ordinary life in early 1st century Judea, its politics, its people, the divisions amongst the Jews, and history leading up to the war. He also keeps his account very secular and without recourse to religion. And this work was written around the same time or earlier than the Gospel of Mark, and certainly earlier than Matthew, Luke and John, which came a few decades later. His other well-known work, Antiquitates Judaicae, or Antiquities of the Jews, was written around 20 years later, and as the name suggests, this was a wider history of the Jews from olden times to the late 1st century. Both of these works are hugely important because they are the sole sources we have that document many important events in Judea and Jewish history. Importantly, for Christian early history, they contain a treasure trove of knowledge of the period from Herod the Great's rule up to the Jewish war with the Romans, and somewhat ironically, Christian apologists use Josephus to fill in the considerable gaps of information about this period that aren't mentioned in the Gospels themselves. So, with Josephus travelling and working in the same geographic locations as Jesus did and trekking through many of the same villages, towns and cities mentioned in the Gospels, you would be forgiven for thinking Jesus, his followers and his miracles should have figured fairly large in Josephus' works if we are to believe the miracle-packed Gospel accounts. Surely you must have encountered the lepers who had been cleansed, the people who had been exorcised of demons and spirits, and heard of the man who could walk on water and who could turn water into wine, the man who resurrected himself after being crucified at Jerusalem. And the same goes for Philo, who knew Jewish affairs in Jerusalem and Judea intimately. And herein lies the problem. Both of these well-educated men present a completely different world and its problems as compared to the Gospels. Neither seems to have heard of Jesus or his wondrous miracles. Philo writes absolutely nothing about a new Messiah, an alleged miracle worker called Jesus who called himself the Son of God. And what about the people that Jesus had miraculously healed? Well, neither Philo nor Josephus have heard of the thousands miraculously cured of every kind of illness and ailment. And what's more curious is that nobody else saw these thousands either and felt compelled to write about them. So we have no record apart from what the Gospel writers wished to write. And as for the people cured by Jesus, they seem to have entirely disappeared. You would think that these people would be a common sight on the street corners and town squares, loudly proclaiming the message and showing their leprosy having been cured. In fact, shouting from the rooftops about this new Messiah who is the real deal and who can cure all instantly. But there is not a trace of these people during this time in Philo and Josephus' accounts. And in terms of evil spirits possessing people, the Gospels make it sound like the problem of possession was endemic to Judea, with plenty of cases around the country, almost like a plague. But neither Philo nor Josephus recorded Judea or Egypt as being particularly infested by, quote, unclean spirits, unquote, and demons which like to possess people. Both countries, by all accounts, seem to have had very little paranormal activity. Perhaps the most curious case is that of Lazarus and the other two people brought back to life by Jesus. They were neither seen nor heard of again, and you would think that they would be proudly shown off by the Christian community as the ultimate proof of the truth of the new religion. But there is no Lazarus or either of the other two walking around Jerusalem or elsewhere, proving their return from the underworld. Lazarus seems to have made a complete disappearing act, not even bothering to turn up at Jesus' crucifixion to complain of a just man being executed or complain of its travesty after the event. Certainly this eighth wonder of the world, a dead man come alive again, did not come to the attention of Josephus or even of Jesus' disciples, who you would think would have recruited him in their evangelism as proof of Jesus' miracles. Instead, Lazarus, just like all the other numerous people, no less than first-hand witnesses to miracles having been healed by Jesus himself, have curiously vanished off the face of the earth and are never heard of again. Even miracles and events which should have been major news during their lives, knowledge of which should have travelled all around Judea, Egypt, and further afield around the Roman Empire, are not recorded by Philo or Josephus or, in fact, any other historian or chronicler like Tacitus or Pliny the Younger. Examples of these are the massacre of innocents by Herod the Great at Bethlehem. Josephus certainly makes Herod's cruelty clear in many examples in his histories, but does not record any children being murdered in Bethlehem. Or the three kings or wise men trekking considerable distances from the east with expensive gifts to see the baby Jesus. There are no records, Jewish or Roman or from the east, or come to that from Syria, Persia, Afghanistan or India, of any wise men or kings leaving their country to visit a baby that is God incarnate. And neither Philo nor Josephus has heard of the curtain miraculously ripping in the inner sanctum of the temple, for example, or earthquakes in Jerusalem, or dead saints rising from their graves like zombies and walking around Jerusalem during the time of Jesus' death, as the Gospels claim. Dead saints trekking through Jerusalem would certainly have raised a few eyebrows and been recorded by the Jewish and Roman authorities and others. In fact, come to that, no Christian who met Jesus firsthand took an interest in writing Jesus' biography and recording these miracles either. Gospels were written much later in the late 1st century, when myth and legend had had time to embellish or generate the stories to flatter an itinerant preacher. And moving on to the year 66 CE and the outbreak of the Jewish war with the Romans, it's surprising that Josephus in his works does not mention the presence of these supposedly vast sections of the community that were now Christians in Galilee, Judea, or even Jerusalem, never mind Syria and beyond. In fact, there doesn't seem to have been many Christians at all in the decades before and during the build-up to the war. None of the locations like Capernaum, Bethlehem, the Sea of Galilee, or the town of Tiberias, which are firmly associated with Christianity and Jesus, are linked by Josephus to the new cult. And let's not forget Josephus, as the Jewish commander in the area, travelled extensively organising defences in the Galilee area and meeting people and village and town leaders. Even sites like Mount Tabor, for instance, where the Jews put up a fight and which Josephus mentions in his account, he does not include Christians in the narrative. Mount Tabor was the location where the story of the Transfiguration happened. In short, Jesus met Moses and Elijah and was shown in heavenly glory. And you would think there would be Christians living here and maintaining some sort of shrine or early memorial to the event, and therefore they would get mentioned in some way or another. Importantly, Josephus mentions many other sects, communities and groups in Judea and Jerusalem of that time. Ancient Judea, after all, was a sort of crossroads, being on the way from Asia Minor and Greece to Egypt and Africa. And the various communities that do get a mention are the Greek pagans, the Romans, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sicarii, and the Seleucid Greeks, meaning the pagans, and so on. But there is no mention of Christians in Galilee or to the north in Samaria or even in Jerusalem, where Jesus supposedly entered in triumph with huge crowds welcoming him in. And the same goes for Philo as well, who seems not to have heard at all about the meteoric rise of this new cult. It's almost as if they didn't exist, or certainly were too small in numbers to be significant and to be mentioned. So why is there such a discrepancy and contrast between the writings of well-educated and knowledgeable personalities like Josephus and Philo and the unknown gospel writers? And importantly, who should we believe? The narratives that show life as plain and working according to the laws of nature, that life during the time of Jesus, as in this day and age, was pretty much as you would expect it, entirely free from the supernatural, or the narratives in the Gospels that make Judea resemble a veritable Alice in Wonderland, full of miracles and the supernatural and the extraordinary and the walking dead. It's almost as if Philo and Josephus, and in fact other historians of that time like Tacitus and Pliny, live in a completely separate and parallel world from the Gospel writers and early Christians. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video to help the channel in the YouTube algorithm, and a subscribe to the channel would be extra helpful. And at this point, I'd also like to slip in a big thanks to my Patreons for helping keeping the channel going and being along with me on this ride. And if you like the channel content and you'd like to help in some way yourself, the link to Patreon and the other ways to help the channel are given in the description section below. Now, I'm sure anyone who's read the works of Philo and Josephus will point out that although Philo does not mention Jesus and the Christians at all, they do get mentioned by Josephus, albeit very briefly, in 3 separate passages. Now, these mentions are not in the Jewish War at all, but rather in his second work, Antiquities of the Jews, which was written around 94 CE, around 20 years after he wrote the Jewish War, and when we can safely say the Christian community had grown and was more on the radar. At least one of these passages, though, is extremely suspect, so let's quickly go through them and discuss whether they are considered genuine. One reference in Antiquities is specifically about Jesus and is now called the Testimonium Flavianum. And this is found in Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3. This text is highly controversial, and that's because by general consensus, which includes Christian historians as well, it's recognized as a later insertion and not authentic. At best, it's a modification of something that Josephus may have written. So why is it regarded as being a fake? Well, firstly, it describes Jesus in rather artificial and glowing terms, considering Josephus was a committed Jew. He calls him a gifted man and a worker of miracles. He also calls him the Christ, in other words, the Messiah, which a committed Jew would not do. He says Jesus rose from the dead after being crucified and appears to his followers as if it were a fact rather than an assertion, and that the Jewish prophets had foretold of his coming, again something that a Christian rather than a Jew would claim. Secondly, Josephus never uses this kind of flattering language, even for the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who saved Josephus from death and who encouraged Josephus to write his history of the war. And he doesn't even use it for Jewish historical giants like Moses or Abraham, for instance, so the language seems entirely incongruent. And thirdly, even if we accept that Josephus may have written it, its very briefness, the fact that it's only a small paragraph, counts against it. Jesus is never mentioned as a messianic figure or someone of importance again in the book, and that indicates the lack of importance Josephus gives to the new religion and its founder. In other words, Josephus's silence on Jesus, his miracles, and his followers in the rest of the book, and the complete absence of any mention of Jesus and Christianity in the Jewish War speaks volumes, and this silence is more powerful than the short paragraph itself. The second passage related to Christianity concerns John the Baptist, and this is in Book 18, Chapter 5, Section 2. Now, this section is generally considered reliable. John the Baptist may well have existed and was a popular preacher. He was killed by Herod Antipas at some point in case he became a focal point for rebellion. And the reason it can be taken as probably genuine is that it is written pretty much as straightforward history. There's no mention of the supernatural and miraculous at all, and as with the suspect section on Jesus, Josephus is simply writing about a popular preacher of the time. This passage, of course, doesn't help Christianity and its claims regarding Jesus in any way, but may prove John the Baptist existed, and that's fine. Nobody is disputing preachers like John didn't exist. In fact, it was a time of much religious fervor, with other messiahs and leaders like Titus and Judas of Galilee also rising. The third passage in chapter 9, section 1, often referred to as the James passage, mentions James, the brother of Jesus. The text mentions James being stoned to death for some unnamed transgression. Christians also point to this section of the book due to the mention of Jesus, quote, who is called Christ, unquote. Again, this is probably genuine as there is no hyperbole and glowing language regarding Jesus, and it's written in an informative, neutral, and matter-of-fact tone. And unless you think Jesus didn't exist at all, then it's not controversial. It simply mentions the existence of Jesus and that his followers saw him as the Anointed One. Again, the fact that the passage is more on James being stoned rather than focusing on Jesus and his numerous miracles also speaks volumes. But I'll be going through these references and analysing them in more detail in a separate video at some point in the future. Both these sections regarding the death of John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus, raise the same questions. If the Christian community was so sizable, why were they not up in arms or even complaining to the Roman authorities about these executions? Josephus mentions no complaints by the Christian community, demonstrations or gatherings in public squares, etc., questioning these deaths. And this complete absence, again, of Christians seems to militate against large numbers. Surely someone would have taken the lead and utilized the Christian community's numerical strength to raise questions. Let's, for argument's sake, run with the Christian claim that there were numerous converts during the first half of the first century. The question that arises is where these multitudes of Christians suddenly disappeared to during the war. This distinct lack of Christians in Jerusalem and in fact in the other main war areas like Galilee at that time was and has been pondered over by Christian apologists ever since Roman times, and there have been several explanations offered, some old and some new. The older explanations come from the various early church fathers and their defense of the Gospels, and some of these are Origen from the 2nd century and Eusebius and Epiphanius of Salamis from the 4th century. And all these characters were familiar with the work of Josephus, and consequently there are common themes running through all these early church fathers' writings. One is that the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem and the eventual eviction of Jews from Judea was a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy as specified in the Gospels. The Jews had rejected Christ and therefore, in an example of divine punishment, were destroyed and later ejected from their homeland. The siege of the city, the famine inside the metropolis, and the subsequent destruction had all been foretold by Jesus, but the Christians by extension had been saved because they were believers. Secondly, it's common to find these chroniclers concentrating on the brief references to Jesus, John the Baptist, and James in Antiquities, which I talked about earlier, to prove the veracity of the Gospels and the existence of Jesus. But they largely ignore the lack of Christian presence in the Jewish war, even though it was written earlier by Josephus and has much more detail on the first 50 years and the war itself, although they don't hesitate to use it when required for information regarding the politics and military situation of the time and the war. So, several reasons are put forward. To explain the lack of presence of believers, some Christian apologists and theologians argue that the Christians fled the country before the conflict with the Romans. Eusebius attributes it to a miracle, claiming that a Christian had had a revelation telling him that the Christians must leave the city, thus leaving only the Jews in Jerusalem to their doom. And so the Christians evacuated the city before the siege of Jerusalem commenced proper, and hence the lack of visibility of Christians during the war. Quote, the members of the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to acceptable persons there, were ordered to leave the city before the war began and settle in a town in Perea called Pella. But how could these huge numbers of Christians, if we accept the gospel claims, suddenly all flee from Judea without even a mention by contemporary writers? There's no mention of an exodus from Judea by the Christians at all in historical records. And if we, for a moment, accept that a miracle had occurred, it only shows the Christian God in bad light, condemning tens of thousands of innocent Jewish men, women, and children to famine and death in the city. The city of Pella, by the way, was around 17 miles to the south of the Sea of Galilee, and this was an area that was scoured through by Vespasian's army before the siege of Jerusalem, so it wasn't that the town was particularly far away from the war zone. The same explanation is used by Epiphanius of Salamis in his work Panarion, which he wrote to counter Christian heresies of the time. The Christians left thanks to heavenly assistance, he argues, because they knew the city would be destroyed. Quote, for they, meaning the Christians, all settled in Pella and gave it clear that they had left the city by divine providence in order to escape the destruction. Origen, another Christian church father, also suggests the Christians had heeded Jesus' warnings, although he does not go as far as suggesting a revelation by a Christian in the city that saved the believers and destroyed the Jews. He also doesn't mention a flight to Pella or elsewhere, but he does draw attention to Matthew 24 regarding believers being saved in the apocalypse. And at his time, this was interpreted as the war against the Romans and the destruction of Jerusalem. The text he latches onto is Matthew 25:16, which directs people to run to the mountains for safety. Quote, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. So, while he doesn't spell it out, he seems to suggest that the Christians had followed Jesus' advice before the Romans surrounded the city and fled to safer areas. However, Origen is misusing the text. Matthew 24 is clearly talking about the Christian end times rather than simply a war against the Romans, and that is made clear by Matthew 24:14, where the apostles are supposed to preach all around the world first before the world is to be destroyed. But this reasoning doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't mean that the Christians would have been entirely invisible. If their numbers were substantial before the war, Josephus would have mentioned them along with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes when he was explaining the religious landscape of the country. And regarding the war, certainly not all would have fled, especially if we assume there were multitudes of Christians, as the Gospels stress. Thirdly, even if we accept this idea that the Christians fled the city before the siege, it doesn't necessarily mean they fled from Galilee and other places as well, and surely they couldn't have been so organized that all ran away from the country, leaving just the Jews and the pagans. Fourthly, if there was such a large migration of people of a particular religious sect out of the country, then that would itself have been newsworthy and probably would have been mentioned by Josephus in his account. But perhaps most importantly, if the Christians did flee, then this arguably reflects very badly on the community itself. As the Jews were fighting for the independence of the country from harsh Roman imperial rule, it could be argued that the Christians should, if they valued freedom as well, have given their support to the Jews during the war. But we have no record of any Christian leader taking a lead or issuing any directive to the community or even talking about the Roman yoke on the necks of the people, and Josephus records no Christians volunteering to help in the defense of the city. One very important point to note is that despite harsh Roman rule and taxes which led to various Jewish uprisings, if we read the Gospels, we find Jesus seemed to have no reservations about Romans, i.e. pagans, ruling his home country. And that is very strange, and I'll be dealing with this topic in a future video. Another reason alluded to by Origen is mentioned in his book Contra Celsum, Book 3, Chapter 8. Origen suggests the lack of Christian visibility was due to their pacifism. He contrasts the Jews who were rebelling against Rome with the peaceful nature of the local Christians, and therefore implies the Christians were not involved in the war and therefore were left alone by the Romans and vice versa. But this still does not explain Josephus and others not mentioning the supposedly large Christian community at all, even if to say that they remained neutral during the war. A third explanation, and perhaps the popular one in this day and age, offered by modern Christian apologists, is that Josephus in his account was concentrating more on the political and military aspects of the war, and therefore it was not necessary to mention the early Christian community. But this explanation too has problems. As mentioned already, Josephus does tell us about other Jewish sects like the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sicarii, and the Greek pagans, and their roles and conflicts with each other before, during, and after the war. In fact, the fractured nature of the religious landscape of the time and the level of infighting, division, and splits within the Jewish community and leadership is one of the more compelling themes in the book, and one of the biggest reasons for the failure of the Jewish rebellion. Before and during the Siege of Jerusalem, there was considerable infighting and discord between the Jews themselves within the city. The fourth explanation suggested is that early Christians did not see themselves as a separate and distinct religion or sect at this point, and therefore Josephus simply counts them as part of the larger Jewish community. But this goes against the narrative in Acts of the Apostles that the early converts were labelled as Christians in Antioch as early as 40 CE, meaning they were already seen as a separate and distinct messianic breakaway cult by themselves and others a couple of decades or more before the Jewish war. And if Paul before his conversion and other Jews had already begun persecuting Christians shortly after Jesus' death, then the distinction between the two groups was already quite stark. It's difficult for Christian apologists to argue that early Christians still saw themselves as Jewish and then at the same time blame the Jews for killing Jesus and persecuting early Christians like Stephen and other martyrs who were killed or faced hostility by the Jews. After all, declaring that the Messiah had already arrived was certainly a massive deal-breaker with the Jews, who did not consider Jesus as much more than a common preacher, and so the gulf between the two beliefs was sharp and clear from day one. A fifth reason could simply be prejudice or contempt by Josephus regarding Christians who he may have thought of as heretics, but that wouldn't in itself be a reason for ignoring them entirely. As mentioned, he does give us details of other minor Jewish groups to which he was not aligned, like the Essenes or the Sicarii, And of course, writing a history of his people does give the author a chance to write propaganda on or malign a group against which he has deep reservations, just as much as it gives a chance for him to champion a cause for which he has sympathies. The most likely explanation, and one which comes from historians like Guy MacLean Rogers, is that the numbers of the early Christians were probably too insignificant to be mentioned and too few to count in swinging the balance one way or the other during the war. Jesus, it turns out, wasn't followed or hailed by huge crowds wherever he went. He didn't have a huge number of disciples from Syria to Egypt. Instead, his retinue was quite small, and even the evangelization by his disciples during the 30 years after his death wasn't dramatic enough to change the figures significantly enough to register in Josephus's count or merit any attention by Philo of Alexandria. So the anonymous writers of the Gospels exaggerated the figures considerably to flatter and sensationalize the story of Jesus and the apostles after him. And in fact, various Christian apologists agree with this idea that there may well have been too few Christians to count by the time of the Jewish War, as Josephus's factual and detailed account of the times can't be rejected out of hand. But the drawback and difficult issue for these Christians is that accepting that Jesus had few followers means that they are necessarily contradicting their own Gospels, which try and suggest otherwise. So, in summary, who do we believe? The Bible, which portrays a massive Christian community with even Jewish priests converting en masse to Christianity, or independent sources like Josephus and Philo? I'll let you guys think about that and let me know your views in the comments section below. Certainly to me, the obvious answer is that this indicates that the Christian population of Judea was quite small during Philo's time and still small at the time of the Jewish War. Too small to figure in the narrative, and even in Jerusalem, where Jesus was supposedly welcomed by great throngs of people, the population of Christians was probably quite minuscule, if not non-existent. And that's the real reason for their non-show in Josephus and complete disregard by Philo of the new Messiah and his followers. Modern historians, both Christian and non-Christian, tend to agree that the Christian population in the Roman Empire was hovering around the 10% mark by the time of Constantine, around 300 years after Jesus. A fair number, but at the same time still a small minority. So, if we assume this figure is correct, then the growth was not exponential, but much slower and more measured, and the numbers in Judea by the time of the Jewish War in 66 CE would have been too few to be noticed despite the evangelization by early Christians. And that's it for this one. All that remains for me to say is thanks for watching if you managed to hang in there till the end, and hope to see you on the next one.